welcome to Audiovisual Cultures with me, Paula Blair. Hot off the heels of speaking with podcast producer Jack Bowman last time, this time I'm really delighted to be speaking with Brendon Connelly, who is a fiction writer specialising in fiction for audio. And we're going to talk to him about Circles, which is a drama that we mentioned with Jack last time, that Jack directed. And Brendon has created it and written it and executive produced it. So before we speak to Brendon, huge thanks to all our lovely supporters on patreon.com/AV Cultures for all your support. It means so much and it really helps us keep going and make improvements to the podcast. If you would like to try and join the pod and get involved with a membership and support us, do check out that page. And if you stay to the end, I'll give you a couple other ways you can support if you're not too sure about a regular membership. You can also get in touch with us on social media with AV Cultures on Facebook and Twitter and AV Cultures Pod on Instagram. And there's always loads of updates and extra links and lots of cards with promotional stuff for all the episodes in between. So do check out our socials and let us know how you're finding the episodes on those. So I had a really lovely time speaking with Brendon. It's been really interesting learning loads more about audio production in general and specifically in podcasting. And I really hope you get something out of this. I think this is going to be a really emerging just field of work and area for people to engage with and think more about. So yeah, I hope you get as much out of this as I did. I really enjoyed this, and you will too. So I'm really delighted to welcome to the podcast Brendon Connelly, and Brendon is going to very kindly talk to us about a current audio fiction that he has released at the moment. But Brendon, first of all, could we just outline, would you say that you're an audio fiction writer, or is that just one string to your bow?
It's one string. I think it's the string I'm leaning into and playing most heavily at the moment. I tend to think of it as audio drama more than audio fiction. If there's a distinction, I think audio fiction perhaps to me implies prose or something closer to an audio book. I think I'm much more interested, and I hope we get to talk about why, I'm much more interested in something closer to full cast drama, or whether it's full cast, but something that dramatizes as sort of a diegesis rather than as a narration, I think.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction. And hopefully, as we talk about Circles, your current project that's out at the moment, that'll become a lot clearer. So would you be happy then to tell us about Circles? I've been really enjoying listening to it, and just as we're recording this, there's one episode left to go. So I haven't heard all of it yet, but I'm up to date with it. And it's quite, for me anyway, it's a really interesting mystery that's slowly unfolding itself. And it's got these horror inflections. But how would you describe it?
I think that's all fair. It can't be separated from the circumstances of its birth. I think the key thing to say about Circles is how it came into the world. I know a chap called Jack Bowman who has quite a long history of producing audio drama. And at the start of the lockdown, for the pandemic measure lockdown, when the British government put us into lockdown, I'd already been in lockdown personally for a little while. As somebody who was concerned about health risk, earlier in March I went into lockdown. When the government put everybody into lockdown, Jack was looking for a project that he could do. I think the mission from Jack's point of view was to say creativity isn't truncated, we're not handcuffed by these circumstances. And he described it as a sort of an Avengers Assemble project where people from the world of audio drama would come together and pool their effort. And Jack's first project actually became an interview podcast, not dissimilar to this. But I said to him, let's pretend we can still make audio drama. We can still make audio drama. I pitched an idea to him that I think at the time was what I thought was maybe the limit of what would be easily attainable. Okay, so I think the idea came out of the idea that if the actors are all isolated, let's make sure we build the isolation into the narrative. The means of production with the actors thrown to the four winds, as it were. We were in 5 separate cities, the people making Circles. In case there's any sort of audio artifact that arises out of this circumstance, let's make sure that it's part of the narrative. And actually, one of the things I learned is that's not actually going to be a problem. It's quite easy. And in fact, I think, Paula, I think people can listen to some of your earlier conversations and not always be sure whether you were sitting in the same room as somebody or speaking. I think that there are some giveaways, but there are sometimes the audio capacity of these communication systems we use, sometimes the illusion's good enough, and if you lean into it with a bit of mixing and the right post-production, then you evaporate that entirely, and we can record 2 people months, weeks, days apart on opposite sides of the world and make them sound like they're having a conversation. And I should have known this because this is what has been happening in cinema and audio drama for decades, right? Of course. Henry in Eraserhead walks through a door. When he comes out the door on the other side, he's one city and 4 years later, right? I mean, that's just the circumstance where that film was made. And yet the continuity of its editing completely pulls the wool over our eyes. Why would it be any different in audio? But I built into the concept of Circles this sense of isolation, which led to me saying, well, what's a narrative hook that reads like a pitch line? What's something you put on a poster that talks to isolation? And I thought, why does this happen? And there's a lot of tropes, bunkers and space stations and all sorts of angles. And the one to me that seemed the closest, I suppose, really, the one that just resonated the most to my experience was staying at home in a protective circle. And I thought, when we heard mantras like the stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, this sort of seemed like a magical mantra in some way. There was an element of magical thinking to it. As sensible as I think the practice of people genuinely following lockdown, as sensible as that practice actually is, I think that it does resonate with this sort of magical thinking. So the idea I came up with was ritual magical circles, the witchcraft circle, the Wiccan circle of salt or chalk that keeps forces at bay, and if you stay inside, then you're protected. And that was the starting point. Once I had that, I knew, okay, I'm playing in the slight supernatural sort of pool. Lots of ideas came to mind, and as a lifelong fan of Scooby-Doo, and I hope we can speak about why as well. It felt like a sort of a Scooby or a Buffy the Vampire Slayer sort of trope. I've often thought about, as an adult who grew up watching Scooby-Doo and watching these teenagers and how they're perpetually teenagers, and the series keeps getting rebooted and they keep getting, redesigned and the reset button hit over and over again. They're perpetually teenagers. What happens if you're a teenager who stares into the abyss, really, right? I mean, what would happen if a teenager actually spent their time mucking around with these things? So sort of one foot in it being a sort of a Scooby-Doo genre piece, and another sort of foot in the sort of slightly more contemplative sort of, I wouldn't say realistic, that's not what I was saying, but sort of considering a story that talks about something a bit more emotionally matured, I suppose, really, than the Scooby-Doo stories, reflecting on them from all these years I spent with them. I thought, okay, I'm going to make this about a bunch of friends who meddled with a demon and meddled the word, that's the Scooby-Doo word, meddled with these forces when they were teenagers, and now 10 years later they've gone on with their lives and they're not friends anymore. I think that's the normal experience. So what happens if I woke up tomorrow and I had to do something very high pressure with the people I knew as teenagers, what would the fallout of that be, really? So that's what Circles is. So it's characters connecting a long way away, their means of communication, and therefore the format of the thing is a series of phone calls. I think that speaks a little bit to what I was saying earlier about the idea to do something that's non-narrative and representative, in the sense that sort of a naturalism to what we're listening to, in the sense that we're not being told, we're being shown. If I play the audio of a telephone call, you are in a very sympathetic position to the person who was on one end of that telephone call. So your experience of listening to Circles, whenever you listen to a phone call, you as the listener, as much as possible, I think enough for it to be hopefully very engaging and a bit transporting, you're in the position of one of those two characters. And we sit in a cinema and we sit in a big dark room collectively with large numbers of people eating popcorn, watching a series of images that rapidly change their point of view, and time is allied and all sorts of stuff happens. And yet we get engrossed and we feel that we're those characters, and sometimes we're transported into that diegesis. So I think experience suggests you don't have to go as far as we did with Circles to draw an audience into your narrative, right? It doesn't need to be as one-to-one, and yet we could do something that was that one-to-one that I wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I suppose that's the way of our lives that it has been this year, where we've had to rely on technology more than ever for connection, but we're still, in a way, it can make us more aware of our distance from one another.
Yeah.
And I think that's really coming across in Circles, is you can, you really get the feeling that they are all spread out across time and space. They're not even always in the same time zone, even, isn't that right? They're all in different parts
It's
of the
absolutely
world.
true, and it's sometimes sort of specified, really, where they say, oh, it must be early where you are, or something like that. There's a little hidden set of there's a lot of hidden codes and patterns in Circles. Actually, there's an awful lot of nothing's an accident. I enjoyed a lot creating a lot of extra sort of symbols in there, really, and I think one of them is to do with where they are. In the sort of lore of ritual circles, very often they're associated with compass points. And each of the four characters is associated with a different compass point. The symbolism that has been associated with those compass points in folklore, we have woven into those characters, and that can be on a very simple level, like the north is associated with having a plan and being the person to be followed in the way that the compass needle points north, and that it's also associated with the element of earth. Therefore, Naomi is Naomi Atkins, and at a very simple level, Atkins relates to Adam, made of earth, and red earth, and there are associations there. But she's the quite down to earth one in some respects, but she's also the one with the plan. So this has become a sort of an organizing principle for the four characters, and the way that they have different narrative functions, actually, and that's barely specified. But if you were to go back and listen again, Paula, you would actually see there are some references to it, and geography is woven into it a little bit. And one of the mysteries, one of the clues, actually hinges on where somebody is, actually, because you don't know where they are when you're speaking to them on the phone. That's necessarily right. And where physically somebody is associated with their compass point. It's associated with their various elemental associations and the illusions around that we worked in. And this is dazzlingly pretentious for what is essentially a sort of a Scooby-Doo homage. But I think there's a level in which organizing principles make sure characters don't wander into one another's lines. From a writer's point of view, that's a very practical way of keeping things straight. Once you know who they are and what they want, you can build these organizing principles that also then sort of maintain the distinction between those in the way that they're presented, and therefore I think it reads unconsciously clearly, if that makes sense. It reads very consciously clearly in one way, but you don't betray it with various elements that are less obvious underneath. And I think another thing is it's fun to have puzzles in things.
Oh yeah.
So as somebody who likes puzzles an awful lot, I hope that there's some people listening to it who enjoy sifting through these little jigsaw pieces.
I think I certainly am, yes, because I listened to the third episode, and that's where things start to become revealed a little bit, but you're still not 100% sure. Oh, is that, you start to question things a bit, and you do pick up on, right, so that's the kind of location that it sounds like that person is in, but is that really what's going on? And because we can't see anybody, were they really? And there's this mystery about being able to get hold of one person, and it's really unclear whose voice that was. And there are those clues, and I think it's all in the sound design, really, isn't it? It's so layered.
We had to be very careful with the sound design.
Yeah.
Actually, very careful. everybody was recorded kind of clear. And then everything was created around that to ensure we had full control of what the EQ, what the room balance sounded like, what space they were in. And sometimes it's very simple as in a conversation, making sure that they're differentiated across channels. So if someone's listening in stereo, it's a little easier to pull them apart. But that, in a way, that's the audio version of the over-the-shoulder shot in cinema. Really, it gives you a sort of sense of geography of where people are. We come off of the starting block straight away with somebody saying something about where they are that I want you to question, and I don't really want to dig into why, but all will be revealed. I mean, the whole running time of the whole thing's about 100 and it's less than 100 minutes. No, it's not. It's much less than that, actually. In the edited version, it's less than 80 minutes. So we've come in at something that's about 80 minutes. So it's like a short feature length thing, but we've broken it into episodes, and we're using episodic structure very much as part of the storytelling. And there's a lot of cliffhanger mechanics, and this is this episode and this is this episode. So the first episode is very much introducing, it's very much an introductory set of information, really, and to give us the stakes and tell us who everybody is. The second one is the mystery episode, in which everybody is being a detective on some level. The third one is about giving a different perspective and looking at something from a different angle. And then the fourth one is kind of the horror episode, actually, really. That's where we've decided to deliver on the premise. I think you sort of have an obligation. At the point I sort of said we've got a demon involved, we had to decide what we were going to do with that, and for it to have any emotional weight, it had to mean something. So I had to decide what it meant, really, what it was. The various meanings of this demon are different depending on which of the four characters we're dealing with, but they all had this, I suppose it's an encounter with a demon, a road away from Damascus event, I suppose, really, in their teenage years, where they encountered something that was transformative, right, and it changed their relationships slowly but lastingly. We've got a character who found faith as a result of this, which as an atheist was difficult to write, but something that I wanted to write responsibly. We found a character who wanted to effectively crack the science of it, really. And that it was quite easy for that Valma character, really, to become the protagonist, as being the one I could identify with the most. We had someone who tried to push it down. And to live a hedonistic life and to have a life of pleasure, really. And we had a dog who we can only suppose, right? And that to me was obviously an inevitable part of the Scooby-Doo pattern. So having a character like a dog whose reaction to something, is unknowable to us, just gives us a sort of a contrast point, a sort of a control group for everybody else's feeling. But once you do bring a demon into it, you've got to decide whether you're gonna use that in a horror way. And we decided to, and we think that it's very intimate having something in your ears, like I was saying before, really. And I think there's some scope to be a little unnerving when you're that close to someone. And I think more than audiovisual stuff, pure audio stuff is actually more inside your head. I think, really. I think our sense of vision is better at distancing what we're looking at than our sense of auditory perception. I think also with headphones, and if people take our encouragement to listen loud, the furthest away from you we are is on your shoulder at any moment. To resist the fun you can have in trying to unnerve people when you've got the potential there, how could we resist?
I've been listening with headphones through an app on my phone. Yes, I think when you have it turned up loud, especially, that's when you can really pick up on, is there something going on in the bottom layer of the sound? What is that? Is that just me? And you start to I was starting to question, is it my tinnitus? Is it what is it that I'm hearing at the minute? Because there's something quite creepy going on. And or you really pick up on, I noticed I think it was the third episode, but I think there's a shift in the point of audition where there's a phone call between two of the characters, and it switches from you being with one of them to being with the other one.
Yes.
And that was really noticeable, I think, because it's in your ears.
Yes.
And you really notice that difference in the voice quality. that you've
It's an
actually...
auditory through the looking glass moment.
Yeah,
really.
definitely, yeah.
It does happen in multiple episodes, actually, which is interesting to me that you've noticed it less often than I think you experienced it.
Yeah, I think it was just maybe I was more distracted with the first couple. Maybe I was listening more intently, possibly in the third episode, because I think that was the one for me where I thought, okay, everything's unraveling now. This is brilliant, you know. And it really, maybe that was the one that really hooked me in. And
Right.
so maybe I was concentrating more. It was possibly that. So I think it's one where you need to really actually actively listen, and I probably, maybe I'm guilty of not
I
doing that
think I
enough.
think I think it's encouraged, and I think it's quite easy.
Yeah.
I think it's quite easy to, I mean, obviously, synchrony between our vision and our audition is essential, right? From an evolutionary point of view, synchronicity between them has become crucial and part of the way that we process them. And we're giving you just one of these things. So if you're paying attention to something with your eyes, I think it can be proven to shift what you're hearing, and vice versa. The McGurk effect, I think you may be aware of the McGurk effect, where you watch someone and they're saying da 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 da, and you can put it with lips that are saying fa 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 or ba ba ba, and it
Okay.
changes actually what you hear. That's a very sort of a clear representation of how this works. Walter Murch, the film editor, talks about synchronizing footsteps for people walking, and he says if you synchronize badly with one person, it feels off. You synchronize badly with two people, and it feels off. But once you've got 2.5 people, once you've got 5 feet moving, you can kind of put the footsteps anywhere and we can't track it unless they're all walking simultaneously, right? If they're all in rhythm, that might as well just be one person walking. But if you've got 5 different intervals, as it were, really, we can't synchronize the audio with it, and therefore you can just cheat as a film editor and just put it anywhere. Being aware of this, I think it's a real challenge we face in audio drama, actually, is getting people to listen under the most conducive circumstances. And I think that's another thing that's happened this year. And I think there was a real boom in audiences of audio drama as we approached the start of the year, and in fact into this year. And as people stop commuting, it's really hit audience numbers. First of all, because when you're working at home or something, there's nothing stopping you having, I don't know, Brooklyn 911 running on the television in the background or whatever. Whereas that's a sort of a bit of a harder thing to have on your commute, or
Yeah.
you're not as likely to look at it. So there are sort of audience spaces that we've lost a lot of, really. But I think of people on their commute and how, you get sort of highway hypnosis, right? You sort of go blind to your circumstance and you can get lost in what you're listening to. And that would have been ideal for us. So I do recommend people listen probably in bed with their eyes closed with headphones on would be ideal, actually.
Yeah.
That would be great. I mean, if anyone's got a flotation tank, go ahead. But and the more you can remove other stimulus, I think the less you're doing two things at once. And I think there is a lot of people scrolling through Twitter while they're watching television these days, and things like that. And I think
Yeah.
that's hurt TV a lot, and I think it's impacted on the way people engage with it in a way that I think it would shape what we see in future, actually. And I think we'll see even more drama that's designed to be casually, with greater redundancy of plot points and greater redundancy of narration and greater redundancy of repeated stressed information, so that people can look at their phone while they're watching it. I think we're just shifting towards that as a taste through our behaviors, and that's sad, but that's not really something we can do. We can't monopolize your visual space through your ears, so we sort of do need you to meet us in the middle a little bit, really.
Yeah, it takes a great deal of imagination. I mean, I'm finding listening to it, it's sparking my imagination quite a bit. You're hearing somebody describing their location, and
Yes.
you're maybe hearing those elements of it. So you may be hearing a little bit of wind. So it seems like there's trees rustling and they might be outside, but you're not 100% sure. Or you're hearing somebody rustling through drawers and slamming them shut. So it seems like they're in a bedroom, but they're not necessarily. And it's sort of you're imagining it visually. So in a way, it is playing out a bit like a film or television if you imagine it in your mind. And then you can also think about, well, I can decide what these characters look like, or what their location looks like, or whatever. So in a way, it frees it up quite a bit. But yes, it does take that concentration. And I think it's really interesting how the shape of the drama, because it has done this non-linear thing of the third episode has actually gone back in time. And I think that really grabbed my attention and it made me stop what I was doing and just listen. So maybe there's something in that. Maybe there's, because I think culturally we have got very used to, I have to do all the things all the time and we're too busy. And now in this, a lot of us are in now these different tiers and stages of lockdown, but it feels like a post-lockdown proper era, and we're back to, we've forgotten all the things that we learned about stopping and slowing down, and we're going back to, I have to do all the things all the time again. And to just take the time to properly listen to something is, it's really valuable. And so in a way I would recommend this series because it isn't long. It isn't really that long at all. It's not a huge investment of time, and you might get more out of it than a TV program that's been, not had as much thought or care necessarily, and might stop you in your tracks. So if that's something it can achieve, then that's a great thing, hopefully.
I hope ultimately it achieves the same thing that any drama does, really, which is that there's some sort of engagement and that it resonates. And that we are building to a sort of a point. I don't feel like I'm there to lecture, and it's not a new point. We've got our own take on it, but it's not that I have some great revelation into the human condition. We've millennia of dramas that have covered similar ground. People say stories are empathy machines, right? And I think that one of the things we're talking about here again and again and again, Paula, is about how this is about empathy, really, because I think audio is really good for it for the reasons we talked about. So this story ultimately is about sort of living through some sort of simulated human experiences, really. There's no way of putting it. And I think that ultimately, by the end of the fourth episode, what I would like to happen is a sense of a good story in a truly Aristotelian sort of sense of it, really. And I am going off the charts for my pretension about this Scooby-Doo homage. I'm fully aware of this. But if at the end, if people have sort of cared a bit about the stakes, I think we've done our job. And I think that some of the playing around we've done along the way works to that end, and that's why it's there. But it is interesting that there's a lot of shifting of perspective, whether it's moving from one end of a phone call to another, or people talking about a phone call to somebody who was not in that call, or moving back in time so we hear a call a second time. I don't really want to give away too much, but I think actually ultimately what we're going to have to do to really, maybe we shouldn't do it, I'm tempted to do a fifth episode which is non-narrative and non-fiction, which is basically totally pulling back the curtain and explaining all the mechanics of the thing, in a sense that there are quite a lot of puzzles in here. And I think it's probably going to be fun to give people the answers because they're not all narrative puzzles. So I'll say now to anybody who's listening to this now, the names are not accidents. So the surnames like Atkins, of course, has some sort of, but the first names of these characters are all 5 letters long, and there's a reason for that. Looking at them reveals something, but that's not the way people normally engage in things like this. It's just an entirely sort of ancillary sort of like set of meanings and hopefully pleasures in there. I think because it's short enough that you can listen a few times, or you could listen to this sort of final behind the scenes commentary, as it were, and go back and listen again. I think it might be worth it, actually. And also because I think the means of distribution through podcasts are such that you'll have people subscribe to your feed for a while, but I think you can lose them. They can clear up and tidy it up after a point and things like that. It's not like we're the BBC and we'll always be there and we can come back. If the BBC took EastEnders off air for several months, they can come back and the BBC is still there. We would have to reconnect to an audience if we came back after several months. So I think we might do something like that to keep the communication alive while we try and work out what, if anything, we'll do next, actually. Because it is a complete and discrete story in 4 episodes, but the nature of publishing anything in the way, if you're not Disney, if you don't have some sort of pre-installed distribution network, you're starting from zero every time. we've had small thousands of people listening to this thing, which suggests that if there were going to be 100 episodes of it, we would be able to grow quite a good audience by the end. But across the space of effectively 3 weeks, and I think actually it's less than 3 weeks is the release schedule for the whole thing, because we're playing Halloween season, right? That's the rules that we're trying to fit into everybody's October mindset. We don't have long to reach people. So I have been thinking, it's a strange responsibility to feel I have as a sort of a storyteller, really, but I've been thinking about, well, how do we keep the audience engaged after the story is finished? So we might do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose even from a production point of view, because I think I don't want to make too many assumptions, but the average viewer, for example, or that's me from my film background, but the average listener, the average audience member, they don't necessarily know how much goes into production of anything like this.
No.
And if you asked any lay listener, for example, they might just think, oh, it's just a bunch of actors and they talk into a microphone and then somebody patches it together and then they put it out. And it's so much more complicated than that. So even from that production point of view, and the amount of planning of the puzzles that you've done might be interesting, just to, in that sense, to reveal behind the curtain. So just to show, right, it's a big patchwork of a puzzle, but also there's all of these different elements to putting it together and designing it and making sure it works. So like certainly from that point of view, I'd be really fascinated to hear more about that end of things. And I'm a bit of a puzzler myself as well. And, maybe not a lifelong Scooby-Doo fan, but certainly a childhood one. It makes you smile when you hear those Scooby-Doo-like references and the way they talk about Frankie the dog. And also there are some Buffy references throughout as well. And, there's one character calls the others a dork, for being so into Buffy. And there are quite a lot of us out there who are very proud dorks. So...
Well, they definitely are in this conversation right now, I feel.
Yeah.
I think the dog Frankie actually incidentally is named after Frank Welker, who has voiced Scooby-Doo for a long time now. So it's our homage to Scooby's current voice actor.
Lovely.
Scooby's original voice actor was called Don, and I think that's a bit of a loaded name at the moment, so we went with Frankie instead. But thinking of Dons, I think that speaks to why I'm really fond of Scooby-Doo. It's always been this series about how people manufacture fear. And every episode in classic Scooby-Doo was normally somebody greedy, but certainly somebody created a culture of fear. And a bunch of kids who, at the time when the series was conceived, were a little bit post-Woodstock or whatever, but they certainly weren't. There was something lightly countercultural about them debunking fearmongers. I think that resonates, actually. It was a young show, right? And I think it spoke to something that still goes on, a sort of a manufacturing of consent through enemy, through making monsters. You won't find anyone as overly invested in Scooby-Doo as me, but I think the best episodes really do something about that. And I think for years Scooby-Doo was rubbish. Right. I mean, essentially, it was just bad craftsmanship in terms of its polish and in terms of structure, because our hands were tied, because they had these incredibly tight schedules. The high watermarks of craft in it are amazing. So Casey Kasem's original voice performance of Shaggy still resonates, and everyone sort of has some connection to that. And the beautifully painted backdrops go far beyond what you would expect a commercial artist to be able to do on the schedule they were working on. The good bits of it are really good. The shining elements really do stand out. And then about 10 years ago, there was a show called Mystery Incorporated, which was a sort of another reboot of Scooby-Doo. And I think the scripts were kind of up to the task for the first time then, actually. And since then, it's actually been quite solid. Be Cool Scooby-Doo, which came afterwards, is very comedic, but much more tightly written than it was before. And the animation style is very different than we're used to. But lots of good work from the craftspeople on it. Notwithstanding the very disappointing, messy, sort of corporately butchered feature film of earlier this year, Scoob, I think we're going through a sort of a golden age of Scooby-Doo. I think what happened with Scoob, the feature film of Scoob was given the responsibility of launching what they thought was going to be like a Hanna-Barbera movie universe, because that's the new paradigm, right? Thank you, Marvel. And they were really pushed to distort their film outside of any sort of practical story shape to sort of serve that function, and it just collapses. I'd say the new Scoob movie is very comparable to the late 60s Scooby-Doo cartoons in that essentially it's rubbish, but the really good things are really good.
It just makes me think of all the backdrops that repeat constantly.
But why throw them away?
No, but they are, you're right, they are gorgeous. They're beautifully painted and designed and everything. And the thrill of it when I'm just thinking of watching episodes as a kid, and the thrill of it is, can you guess which of the two other characters it was who did it?
Sometimes three, Paula, to be fair.
Yeah.
Occasionally there are 3 cups under which the ball might be hidden.
And there were plenty of times when you didn't get it right, it had you guessing.
If you look at Agatha Christie, a lot of Agatha Christie is guess which of these people is the murderer. And you've got a sort of a small group of people, but the best Agatha Christie is you're asking the wrong question. So at the risk of spoiling Murder on the Orient Express, the solution isn't which of these is the murderer, it's what's wrong with that question. I think that Scooby-Doo's never once in the history of Scooby-Doo has there been this complete rug pull twist, actually. And that would be my ambition as a Scooby-Doo writer. So if anybody from from us is listening right now, I would love to come in and do a Scooby-Doo that just completely has a total M. Night Shyamalan Twilight Zone twist or whatever, in which the audience's perception is totally rearranged. Because there's no sort of murder mystery in Circles, the elements of mystery that are in there, it's not such a straight up guessing game, right? It's not which of these two did it. It's what's going on here then. And I think some of it's quite easy to pin down. I think that we're quite fair. Because in the sort of Agatha Christie sense, I think that it's not fun if you don't put all the clues in plain sight.
There is a formula there that if you can just look at it in the correct angle, you'll crack it. So yes, I'm looking forward to things being revealed, but I really don't know. I've got ideas, I've got questions, but I don't know the answer. So that's a quite exciting moment to be in. I'm thinking as well that just to think back to, you were saying about it's of the time that it's come out of, it's really very much a lockdown creative project. And you were saying about the manufacture of fear, and there's such a fine line at the moment between being scared of something, and is there a point where you could be too scared, or is there a point where you're not scared enough? And that idea of this unseen threat, and you're being told by somebody who seems to be in control, this is what you have to do and you'll be safe, but is it enough, or is it too much? And I suppose that's where I'm trying to tease things out at the moment. Do you have any thoughts on that, Brendon? Is there anything you can tell us without doing spoilers, or what do you think?
I think you've just asked all the questions that we're asking there, really, Paula. I think you've come on board with our ideas, and I think that, as I said, it was born very much from circumstance. I think that what we conclude resonates with my feelings about our circumstance, I suppose. This isn't a show about lockdown. This isn't a show. It's a show amid lockdown. It's a show that happens in it, and therefore it can't help but comment on it, and obviously it's where it came from. But I think ultimately what it's about is about that question of how do you relate to the people how do you heal, how do you put old relationships back together again? Do you put old relationships back together again? And if you have to, how do you do that? And it's about forgiveness, I suppose, really, and it's about old friends, and it's about these very simple emotional ideas, really. That's very much where it ends, is about, we started a story with 4 friends hitting the ground running because there's a fire that needs to be put out effectively, right? There's a panic on, and we end with what happens because they've done this. What we've got here is essentially imagine you were staying with old friends at the time of the lockdown, and you were just ready to leave, but you couldn't. You know, what do the next couple of days look like? How do you reconcile your old relationships in that space? Do you know what I mean? It's that it's closer to that. If it's really about lockdown at all, it's about, you know, not everybody's, though it will resonate with elements of everybody's experience. It's not the universal lockdown story, I suppose. But I think hopefully we can all think about relationships we've had, we don't have anymore, old relationships we're trying to maintain, how relationships change over time, our regrets from when we were younger, how we live with them now, how choices we make now are informed by choices we made a long time ago. And that can be as simple as this, you know, the road to or from Damascus thing I was talking about, where we have epiphanies, or I'm not one to necessarily believe, I think it makes good drama that there's a single clear cause and effect between an event happens and life changes. I think normally it requires a little more accretion than that. Real trauma has to happen, which is why, you know, we're operating on such a bright cartoon scale, I suppose. Really, whatever happened to them had to be big enough that it feels like it would have this effect.
And I suppose just to think about, well, what it was that had actually happened in the past. There is this, you do have this, isn't it, like a comic strip of the in a prequel.
You do.
That when I saw that, I thought, gosh, that's a bit Scooby-Doo, isn't it? So I'm really glad you did talk all of that out, because I wasn't sure about bringing that up before. But that prequel bit does tell a bit of that story of why it is they're doing what they're doing in the present. And so why did you decide to do it in a comic form?
I think it's impossible to pull it off, but we gave it a go anyway. And I think there's a stylistic change between when they were teens and now they're grown up. If you look at the difference between Scooby-Doo and Buffy, they're very similar, but they're not the same, are they? Right? And Scooby-Doo's sort of more naive, I suppose. So this sort of nostalgic aesthetic of the comic strip sort of speaks to that, really. They were young. It is in the style. It is evoking the genre of what happened to them, for want of a better way of describing it. These events that happened to it really is supposed to say, it really is supposed to on a level, all these sort of kids on this sort of the subgenre, I think, goes by the handle kids on bikes. These kids on bike stories like Stranger Things, or I suppose in some way E.T. These sort of suburban nostalgic, today people feel very nostalgic about sort of stories. That's our backstory here. So we're going to tell a less naive but still sort of hopefully very story driven second chapter that comes out of that. That's the main reason it's like that. But also, when we put together the sort of visual materials we were going to use to sort of introduce circles to people, what was missing was the characters and some sort of sense of who our cast was. I tried to sort of balance that, because I've sort of done all the most of the social media sort of been invented by me. They're not executed by me. I didn't illustrate the comic. I didn't design the beautiful graphic design. So there's a chap called Happy Toast. Great name. He did our comic. And there's a guy called Ryan Field who did our graphics. Incredibly talented people. But the brief came from me. So if you look at our sort of very moody circles artwork, it's actually, one of the rules was you can only use the colours in this painted Scooby-Doo backdrop, right? So there were sort of codes, even sort of in terms of palette and things like that, but nowhere were there characters. Nowhere was there some sense of this is going to be a story about some people. It was just telling you genre, really. It was just saying slightly creepy. All the message it was giving you is like, this is going to be a bit moody. So we sort of wanted to put something out there that said this has characters in it. It's really as simple as that this is a story about people and relationships. So I think under the circumstances, it was only really possible to do that in a visual, if we were going to do it in any visual way, as a comic strip, really. So I think that was important to making it seem like a good idea. But it's a problem because the style of Chapter Zero isn't really the style of the main story. We've had to try and sort of sell the point that 10 years later things are serious, because they're not particularly serious in the Hanna-Barbera style, if you know what I mean. I mean, Frankie is anthropomorphized to the same extent as Scooby, and that enough sort of pulls you out of the sort of empathy-driven world rules we were sort of trying to use in the main drama. So it's nostalgic. It's a nostalgic flashback. It's a look back at youth, and I think that's why we've done it that way.
And it is very much a message of this is who they were before this thing happened.
Yes.
And this is who they are now, and it makes that clear.
I hope so.
Is there anything more you would like to say about circles, or would you like to think about anything more broadly? I mean, how would you? I'm quite interested to ask because I think it's very lean at the moment, or probably in general. But how do you get something like this funded? How do you get something like this pulled together, especially in this climate? Would you be
You
interested?
don't actually, Paula, I think is the answer to
Yeah,
that question. And
yeah.
I think under the circumstances of its production, it happened. This was made. I mean, it's not really my part to speak on, but I'll tell you what I can. When this was pitched as an everybody comes together to be creative, there wasn't a check involved in that. And everybody volunteered, everybody donated their time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I think I can say, because the press release is going out today, we gave everybody part ownership of it.
Sure.
And what has happened, our little independent show has now attracted a podcast network who have actually added it to their slate of shows. And today the announcement will go out, so people will be listening to it. And it'll have a little promotion from one of their other shows on the front. But what that means is that a little revenue will make its way to the actors,
Oh, that's brilliant news.
producers, and so on. So, in a sort of on a royalty basis, effectively. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's really a good outcome. My only rule was that the show didn't stop halfway through for an advertising break. If they wanted to put a short promo at the start for something and they wanted to put a short promo at the end for something, I think that was great. But disrupting the narrative once it was rolling, I think was not going to work. We've been quite clever in that our sort of narrator voice who reads our credits, we provided him to the network to do the voice for the promotional material as well. Feels sort of cogent with what we've done. Keep the mood going. I think it's not unfair to think if you're going to the cinema, there might be some trailers before the movie. And the secret is, Paula, you've got a little button on your podcast machine that skips you forward 25 seconds or whatever it is. And and I shouldn't be saying this, but there's certainly no real-time media rather than print media where it's so easy to skip the commercials. I think that's a happy outcome for our cast who did this to be part of a project of people being creative at a time when because audio drama's normally made in studios and nobody was going into studios, and it was quite a creative undertaking. I think the way Jack puts it, 5 cities into 3 time zones on 2 continents, all linked simultaneously, working together to produce this thing. And that meant every actor also had to be their own sound engineer, and they had to make sure that they were getting clear audio, and that's a bit of responsibility for them that they don't normally have, and a little bit of technical know-how that they had to acquire just to make it happen. That they're rewarded. Artists should be paid for their work. I mean, it's just that simple, really.
Yeah.
Just
Oh, that's
simple.
good news. Really good news. It's such a tough climate anyway.
Most things like this are sort of post-funded really by things like Patreon or Ko-fi or something like that. And I think that the people I know who have some success, there are 3 models for this actually. There's the huge company, somebody like Gimlet, who makes these huge, expensive Hollywood star sort of audio drama productions, kind of as IP farms, really, so that they then sell the TV rights to Amazon or Netflix for X quadrillion dollars. So something like Homecoming started with Catherine Keener as a podcast, and then became Julia Roberts and later Janelle Monáe on Amazon. And their business model is to create a brand and sell the IP, and that's the exact opposite end of the spectrum of what we can do, though it's not impossible, it could happen to anybody, but when you come with Catherine Keener attached, you have Amazon's attention. Then there's the sort of the ongoing series where people run Patreons or something like crowdfunding Kickstarters or things like that to get things done. And actually our protagonist Tal, they do lots of these. Their career really is as a combined actor and sound designer and editor on a number of podcasts for which they create revenue through Patreon and Ko-fi and so on. And they're quite successful. So good for Tal. I have some friends who have had the success of making a little money to go back into the pot to fund the next thing that way, but also apply for grants. Particularly in the UK, there's quite a few arts grants. If you can demonstrate some capability to pull this off, then I think you're likely to get support. And then the last way of doing it is just selling these things. I don't think people quite realise there are ways to produce something and put it on Audible, no matter who you are. Now, it's quite easy to create something and distribute it as a podcast. Everybody and their dog has a podcast these days, right? But actually, it's quite easy to get things on Audible. Now, it's much less discoverable, and Audible, again, is very much about what title of Hodder and Stoughton paid tens of thousands to put on the front page, right? Or whatever. But if one were to go and search on Audible under my name, they'd find something under there that generates revenue per purchase. There's a royalty scheme. There's a kind of a sort of a similar to sort of Kindle self-publishing way into the Audible system that I think people don't know about. We've not talked at all about my project that's on Audible, but it's not something I self-initiated. It's a sort of a project I came in on as a writer, somebody else's project, to bring a bit of story shape and structure to and to work it out. But what's been interesting is looking at the numbers is that despite it being a much more direct financial model in that people have to purchase your product and you will get a revenue share, it's much less likely to actually generate revenue in the long run because it's much harder to build an audience for the thing. And that's the sort of space where huge publishers and big brands and stars kind of have a monopoly. I think it's much easier when you're giving something away for people to take a punt on something, actually.
Yeah, there's nothing to lose. Apart from a
20 minutes, not even 20 minutes in the case of Circus episode 1, you know.
That's exactly it. Yeah, you can, I think, after a few minutes whether you want to stay with something or not, generally.
Do give it those almost 20 minutes, though, people. I'll say that one of my regrets about Circles is that I think we fell into a bit of a trap that Netflix fall into, actually, regularly. Often there's a temptation where you have a big story beat or a big turning point in your story. You go, that would be a good cliffhanger. I'll put that at the end of the episode. And so we build towards the end of the first episode being quite big. And I think in retrospect, I'd bring that forward quite a long way in the episode, actually, and restructure so that we leave off on a different cliffhanger. I would break the story in different places and I'd pace up the front of it. And it does start in media res and we do hit the ground running. And I think the first episode, there's a lot of working out where we are. Yeah. But I think that what happens at the end of the first episode, people like that so much that I would like to bring it forward so that everyone gets to know that that's part of the deal. You sort of learn what the show is by the end of the first episode, and I think we could have done a better job in teaching them a bit more quickly, I think.
Well, but
maybe 16 minutes isn't too long. I don't know.
That's not, that's still shorter than an average episode of a television program. Say your cliffhanger was 16 minutes into a 22-minute TV show. That's still a big moment, isn't it?
I loved The Good Place, the TV show The Good Place. And one of the things I really liked The Good Place is it got to its block points a couple of beats ahead of schedule every time.
Yeah, I was thinking about The Good Place actually when you were saying about the cliffhanger. I was thinking that exactly because they just hit a big cliffhanger in the middle of an episode sometimes, or the whole end of the first season, and you think, oh gosh, that's everything, or the seeds of it are planted so early on about what's actually happening. So I was thinking that as well.
In retrospect, I wish I thought more about The Good Place when we were making Circles, to be honest, actually, because I think their little band of 4 people thrown together in a supernatural circumstance is closer to what we're doing than I even thought of. Whereas each of their seasons sort of ended with a reboot that had a new season in mind, we really are wrapping things up at the end of the 4th one.
Sure.
But I think it's always possible to tell a second story. I mean, if someone said to me, what's the sequel to Casablanca? I know people would be very skeptical about it, but I believe that there is a good story to be told. It might take a long time and a lot of work to work out what it is. You have to be quite self-aware of all the problems that you could be getting into. And you have to trust that an audience won't just immediately put their defenses up just because you're a sequel to Casablanca. But I believe that there's a great story that can be told probably subsequently to any story, because anything can be the foundation for a story. And similarly, I think when it comes to adaptation, when people talk about fidelity in adaptation, I think it's a bit of a red herring, really. I think if someone said to me, adapt this Jane Austen book or this Stephen King or something, I would totally treat it like a piece of clay or a first draft that I can change in any way to get to telling a story that I believe in and can tell well myself. I don't think I can tell someone else's story as well as I can tell my own. So
Okay.
if I have to change things, then I think I would. I think that's too much concern with fidelity when it comes
Oh
to
yeah.
adaptation. And I don't know why. I think people fetishize continuity in canon. And that's something that I've tried to weaponize in circles a little bit. Part of the game is what riff on Scooby is this, or what riff on Buffy is this, or how can that knowledge help us here, or what continuity and canon is at work here. What did they just say her boyfriend's name is? Hang on, what did they say her boyfriend's name is this time? And so on and things like that. So maybe that was a bit of a smoking gun there, but things like that are hopefully weaponized. The peripheral little bits of additional information, the stuff that would be in those Star Wars extended universe novels that I heard dragged through the mud on one of your podcasts.
Oh.
Maybe that's not fair, but that sort of material, how can you use that? And that
Yeah.
was something I was thinking about a little bit on this story.
Okay, that's really fascinating stuff. Yeah, a lot to think about there. Um, okay, Ben, is there anything else you feel like you would really like to cover that we haven't got to so far?
The only thing I say is I think you can probably tell any story in any medium if you're prepared to change the story to work in that
In the
medium.
medium, yeah,
But
yeah.
when you're doing something in audio, I think you kind of have to grasp it. I'd written a few audio things before, a few produced audio things before, and a lot of unproduced audio things before. And yet, I think there's still a lot of learning to be done. But I think, like if I want to tell you how to cook pancakes, Paula, I'm not going to do it with a sculpture garden. I'm going to write a recipe on a piece of paper. And while I could do it with a sculpture garden, and you walk around and each sculpture quite literally is a figurative representation of the steps, and you can see an egg cracking in the air and the yolk's frozen as it's coming into the bowl or whatever. I can quite clearly relate to you in a way that you can decode, but it's not very practical. How are you going to consult that when you're standing in your kitchen with the ingredients, right? I think, without getting into the McLuhan, the medium is the message, I think choose the medium that suits the message, really. But I did that sort of backwards here. I had to choose a message I think suited the medium, and I think it did come out of the idea of getting in people's ears and being on a phone, and I think this is about phone calls, and I think an awful lot of audio drama is really disguised prose. A lot of it is captain's log or sort of variations on that. I'm not interested in that personally very much as I have written a couple. I'm always looking for ways to use audio in which it doesn't get in the way, in which it's not an obstacle to the
Yeah,
storytelling. And I think that was one of the things that shaped Circles more powerfully than anything else. In what way
yeah.
does the audio not get in the way? In what way does it best benefit us? I did a short called The Hypnotist, in which I wanted to dramatize lots of events purely in audio. And I thought, well, I need a device through which somebody's going to be giving an account. And I thought the trope of hypnotic regression works that way. So what you're literally listening to is the drama of two people sitting in a room, and yet you get their subjective impressions of something that happened a long time before recounted for you. So it was about finding audio devices to tell the story. I think that's still quite untapped, and I'm quite excited to hear what people do.
Yeah.
And I'm excited myself to explore more ways of doing this.
I think certainly if the world does need to change, at least for another couple of years, that's a really exciting testing ground for working in audio and actually re-privileging audio over the visual as well. So, I mean, because podcasting, it's not the same as radio, but they do have parallels and similarities. And just thinking back to other radio dramas that I've heard, on Radio 4 and things, and I think you're onto something with it. Feels like, well, maybe it's an adaptation of prose where they've lifted out the dialogue and fleshed it out a bit and used that to describe what people are doing. But I think that's the difference with Circles. There's so much going on in the soundscape that I can hear what people are doing. And then
Yes.
that helps me see it. So, yes, I think there's definitely something to, especially with the technologies that we've got. And if you're saying that, I mean, the actors themselves using whatever they've got in their houses, for example, that's, it shows you what we can do more on the hoof, even more than before, never mind just in a recording studio?
There's a combination of means of creating the soundscape in
Yeah.
circles, and sometimes you'll hear an actor literally interacting with an object, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you'll hear effectively completely artificial sound design, and sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. It's a bit of Foley that was laid in afterwards. This was all done quite carefully to create the final end result, and I will say I think we went a bit wide of the mark a couple of times, and I think there's a couple of sound effects in the first episode that are a little close. They're a bit too bold. They're not quite natural enough, really. I think we didn't quite weave them into the tapestry, not for any lack of skill on the part of our sound editor, but because it was a very difficult ask. Our sort of shaggy character, Jeff, we were trying to evoke his shagginess a little bit, and I think we went a little cartoon in some ways, a little bit with him. But by the time you get to the fourth episode, some of the audio in there is so incredibly complicated. I don't think anyone will ever really know what is the sound of an actor moving in space or what's laid on, and in fact, you kind of can't tell, and we've sort of artificialized some stuff for reasons to do with the narrative and things like that. It was quite a complicated undertaking, of which, I lit the touch paper and sort of told people what they had to do, and I just had to sit back and sort of listen to them do it and be grateful that they did it. And again, during the whole production, I just sort of sat there and listened. I was there for all of the recording sessions, listening in as a voyeur, really, because once the scripts were delivered, there wasn't much left for me to do apart from the occasional notes. And it is fascinating to see the many levels of production and post-production that go into something like this. Cinema's my first love, really. Sort of moving image storytelling. I'm sort of past making a distinction between TV and cinema now. Really, I think the fundamental language is the same. But at the minute, I'm really intrigued in sort of trying to do some stuff in audio where I think there's just so many people rushing to do it the way that they know that it can do something that's already been done. I just sort of want to try some stuff that's not quite been done. I think. So I'm going to probably you'll be hearing some failures over the next couple of years, Paula, as I sort of.
Failure's good though. That's the testing ground, isn't it? I mean, science only works because things fail. So we need to experiment. We need to be allowed to fail. That's what the arts should be allowed to do as much as science, I think. That would be.
That's the plan. Yeah.
But I really look forward to hearing all your failures and your successes, Brendon.
Well, thank you.
The coming years. I'm sure there will be many successes. Because if Circles is anything to go by, then it's really exciting to see what else you can come up with and to really start to pave the way in what can make audio fiction and I suppose audio script writing really distinctive from the likes of audiobooks or just telling a story, or not just telling a story, but telling a story in an oral storytelling tradition or something.
Yes.
Like actually using, I'm telling stories through people making sounds, whether it's with their mouths or stuff they're doing or whatever, but actually using sound as the medium.
Creating
itself.
a living real-time diegesis, I think, is the thing. That's the game here. And I think bypassing the eyes, learning to lean in, doing a little bit of the visualization or encouraging a bit of visualization. And again, the audience have to meet us halfway. And I would say, Paula, if your game, when you've got all 4 episodes, give it a go, maybe just somewhere where you're not looking at anything, right? And try and see what that experience might be for you. Because though we can't expect anyone to do that, I'm quite sure that it's a better experience for the listener if that's the case. And there's nothing we can do about that. We can't mandate that your headphones only work when you've got a blindfold on, right? It doesn't work like that. But it does do the story the world of good, I think.
If you imagine yourself sitting in a room in the dark, just like these other people that you're with, and you might feel like you're part of the drama, actually. You might feel like you're on the end of these phone calls or bearing witness to these phone calls in a closer way than if you're, like I was saying yesterday, banging around in the kitchen while trying to catch up and not really concentrating properly.
Alexander McKendrick, the great filmmaker, the Ealing filmmaker, was a film teacher. And when he talked to his students about choosing where to put the camera, he talked about this sort of imaginary winged invisible creature, and that the camera would represent its point of view. And I would say the closer you can be to being some sort of disembodied presence floating in the phone lines when you're listening to Circles, the closer you can come to embodying that, like you are a spirit in the phone wires, just listening to this stuff, the closer you are to the best Circles experience.
We have to bring something as well to share in the process, I think.
Sorry, we tried to make as little of that as possible, you know.
No, not at all.
But like reading a book, you've got to read it.
Well, that's it. You have to bring something. I mean, the film critic Mark Kermode says a film is only what you bring to it as well. So it's with anything that we engage in, any work of culture that we engage in, we have to do some of the work. That's just how it is. So
the story happens in your head.
Exactly.
Every time.
And it's an individual experience for everyone who engages. So that's just how it is.
And it's a great privilege to get as close to people's heads as audio allows you to, I think, really. And I think that's why it's quite an exciting medium, I think. And we've just been doing that for a very long time now. So I feel like I've been sitting on your listener's shoulder for quite some time here, Paula.
That's fine. Yes, I won't take up any more of your time, but you've been so generous with talking us through Circles and all your brilliant ideas and everything, Brendon. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this morning.
Not at all. I've enjoyed it.
Great. I just want to really encourage people to really give Circles a good go wherever you pick up your podcasts and really actively listen to it. This has been Audiovisual Cultures with me, Paula Blair, and my very special guest, Brendon Connelly. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, licensed under 3.0 non-commercial Creative Commons attribution, and is available at ccmixter.org. The podcast is released every other Wednesday. Please do rate, share and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And do remember that if you need transcriptions, the best thing to do is find my YouTube channel. If you search for PEA Blair, that's the best thing to do. It's linked on all of our social media as well. And you can get the auto-generated captions. They're not perfect, but they're the best we can do at the minute for transcriptions. And you can also see some of the full recordings of the episodes there as well. Huge thanks to all our members, as we said before, at Patreon. And if you feel like you would really like to support the podcast, but you're not sure about a membership, do go to buymeacoffee.com/PEA Blair, and you can just drop me a $5 there, because everything really helps if you get something out of this. It helps us keep going, it helps improving, and it just means we can keep going for a bit longer, hopefully. So yes, thank you so much for listening. It's been lovely to have you. It's been lovely to have Brendon on this one. I'm learning so much about the wealth of our audio production landscape lately. And so it's just a really exciting time, and hopefully we'll see loads more brilliant things to come. So thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves. Be excellent to each other, and I will catch you next time.